month for yes.
Hi, I'm Lil.
And I'm Fitz.
And you're listening to Knock Once for Yes. We're just beginning to feel the first hint of autumn here, with the promise of misty mornings, cosy evenings, and ghost stories around a roaring fire. But of course, you don't need to wait for autumn to get your spook on, because here at Knock Once for Yes, every day is a good day for a ghost story. So Fitz, what have we got coming up on today's episode?
Coming up, we have lots of amazing true ghost stories from our listeners, and we spend our holidays searching for the she-wolf of France in a haunted castle.
And Fitz gets on his high horse for the paranormal radar. But before we get stuck into all of that, we want to give a massive thank you to all of our wonderful patrons. You guys make this show possible, and for that we're truly grateful.
We're hard at work on our latest bit of Patreon content about the ghosts of RAF Montrose, so if you've not signed up already, do head over to patreon.com/KOFY.
Now, onto the paranormal radar and what's got Fitz's knickers in a twist.
We'll get onto that in just a second, but first I've got a rather creepy story from Denver, Colorado. At 3:28 a.m. on the 11th of August, the Pueblo Police Department received a 911 call from the Imperial Gardens funeral home. The call was disconnected as soon as the dispatcher picked up, and so they sent a police officer to go and check the location whilst they called the number back. Here's where it starts getting creepy. When the dispatcher called the number back, the call was picked up at the other end, but no one spoke. And when the officer that had been dispatched arrived, he found the building securely locked and dark, with no one around. I'll put a link in the show notes on the website to the article where you can also hear the recording of the call.
What? That is so creepy. What is it with 3:30 in the morning?
That was what I was going to say, and it's a weird one. Obviously, again, it could be a fault on the phone line and various other things, but
how was it picked up? So if they called the number back and somebody at the other end picked it up?
Well, I found it more interesting the other way, to be honest, because it could just be a faulty answering machine if they dialed back.
Yeah, I suppose.
But for it actually to call them first, not many people have got auto dialers, and it's not the sort of thing you'd expect a funeral home to have.
Well, and that was the other thing I was going to say. The fact that it came from a funeral home to begin with just triples the creep factor, let's be honest.
Indeed. And like you say, sort of 3 o'clock in the morning, why is it that so many of these things happen and literally it's sort of 3:30 in the morning? We've had the same sort of thing.
We have. This is just what I was going to say. I mean, I've heard a lot of different explanations for it, and some people put it down to sleep patterns, which to me makes perfect sense. That is completely logical. You know, you go through different sleep cycles, and some of them you're closer to wakefulness. But the thing I don't understand is that, like you say, we've both had it happen to us, but only in the haunted house. And that's what makes it so confusing for me. The sleep cycles thing I could understand, but why in my entire life have I only had a problem at 3:30 in the morning in one house, and it happens to be the one that was haunted?
No, it is a bit weird, and I'm afraid I really don't have an answer for you.
So I haven't actually listened to this call. Can you hear anything when it's picked up at the other end?
No, to be honest, the first time I heard it, I thought, oh my God, I can hear a voice. But what actually is, it's in, obviously, a 911 call centre.
Oh, so
there's other voices in the background. So, you hear the first one, you hear, hello, 911, what's your emergency? And it's sort of fairly quiet. And then I heard this faint male voice in the background. I was like, why is nobody telling me that there was a voice on it? And then eventually you hear sort of clacks and keyboard working, and then quietly you hear somebody else in the background go, 911, what's your emergency? And it's sort of, idiot, you're just listening to other people in the call centre.
To be fair, I'm pretty sure I would have had the same thing and thought it was a voice.
Yeah, I mean, there's to be honest, there's nothing to hear, really.
No.
It's basically the lady picking up the call and saying, 911, what's your emergency? And then nothing, and sort of, hello. And then the second bit, of course, is them calling back and going, hello. It's just that the call is picked up.
Yeah, but super creepy all of its own.
Oh yeah, very strange. Like I say, I can imagine like a sort of faulty, like my mobile phone. I don't have a recorded message on it, so it just picks up.
Yeah.
But it wouldn't dial anybody.
But it wouldn't dial
and it was from a landline,
so
it wasn't like somebody bum dialing like in their pocket or
Pocket
something.
dialing.
Yeah. It was a sort of static phone, so
really, really weird.
Mm.
Okay, so I like that one. But what got you all up there on your high horse?
Yes, fetch me my highest of horses. Our second story is one that irked me a little bit. It's on the website for The Mirror, which is a UK newspaper, and relates to a photo taken by urban explorer Rosie Bolton at Tintern Abbey in Wales. She saw nothing when she was visiting the site at the time, only having a creepy feeling, but on reviewing her photos, she saw something on one that she believes is the figure of a hooded monk. Now, I've got a couple of issues with this story. First off, Rosie was sneaking around the site at night after it had closed. She'd basically broken in and knew she wasn't supposed to be there. So, please do not break into places. I cannot say this enough. You could get hurt, you could get arrested, you give real investigators a bad name. People that do things like this are the reason that historic monuments get fenced off so you can't go near them.
Yeah, unfortunately, some of the sites that we've visited just during the daytime and as completely normal tourists have been really, really wary of us as soon as we've mentioned ghosts because they've had a problem with people breaking in the past.
Yeah, it's a bit of a nightmare. Now, I haven't finished on my high horse yet,
Sorry,
I'm afraid.
I interrupted. Do carry on.
The second part of my problem with this story, and I hold the Mirror in as much contempt for this as Miss Bolton, it took me 10 seconds on Google to debunk the photo. If you look at a shot of the same area in daylight, it clearly shows that the hooded figure is in fact a door. I'll put links in the show notes to the Mirror article and to one of the images I found clearly showing the door in daylight for comparison. It just so happens that the photo is from a website of a wedding photographer, so if you're planning on getting married in Wales in the near future, there's an option for you. I can understand someone having a photo that they think is unusual and getting a bit excited about it. We were a little bit the same with Lil's photo from Leicester Guildhall, but I'd expect a journalist to at least do a cursory check.
Yeah, to be fair, I mean, when Fitz first showed me the photo, I could see the hooded figure of a monk, and I was like, I don't understand what your issue is with this photo. I can clearly see a figure. But he is right. A very cursory Google search will show you a picture of the same door in daylight, and you can see exactly what it is. It's just a door frame.
Yeah, it's a door within a door, and it is shaped with a sort of taller peak and almost shoulders. I'm not sure what the sort of construction term for the design would be, but it's the same shape as the larger door around it, which is a clue. Which is what sort of pinged me. I thought, is this just a shadow from the big doorway? And then I looked at another photo and it was just obvious. It was just another door within the big door, the same shape. Okay, rant over. On to spookier things. It's time now for our first story, and this one is from Elizabeth.
I used to work for a historic Victorian house museum. Gothic and spooky, it looks straight out of a horror movie, and in fact has been used in a few Hollywood films. Originally built as a summer home for a wealthy banker and railroad investor, in its 150-year history, there have been at least 3 deaths on the property that are well documented. A death of a workman during construction of the home in the 1860s, the second owner of the home and property in the 1870s from what is believed to have been a stroke, and the final occupant of the house and daughter of the second owner in the 1930s, who lived here full-time during the last few years of her life. For the past 50 years, it has operated as a museum, arts and cultural centre in the community. I didn't know much of the history of the house when I started working there, but my co-worker had done a bit of his own ghost hunting and paranormal research and was happy to share his experiences, which included hearing his name and having his glasses disappear, then reappear in a completely different area of the house, the bedroom of the final occupant of the house, which wasn't even open to the public. Over the years he worked there, they had multiple instances of motion sensors going off, alarms being set off and summoning the police. He'd been at the museum for over 15 years in some capacity and knew more about the house and its residents than anyone else I knew. I didn't have any experiences of my own until I'd worked there for about a year and a half. By then, we'd undergone a massive restoration of the basement and servants' areas. I had witnessed camera footage of disembodied screams in the vestibule of the empty house overnight, and motion-sensitive cameras coming on all on their own. So I knew the house was active, but my experiences seemed to be unique to just me. The basement had public restrooms with automated lights, toilets, and sinks. When I went in, the lights came on automatically, meaning that I was the only one who'd made any sort of movement for the last 10 minutes or so. We were closed for the day, and I could account for all other members of staff. I was in one stall, and 2 stalls away, I heard a toilet flush on its own. Although I knew I was the only person in the restroom, I had to check the other 2 stalls, but I was alone. This happened a couple more times over the next few years as I worked there. Another area I had a couple of experiences in was the elevator. The modern elevator was part of the recent renovation and occupied the location of a previous dumbwaiter, which had been big enough for the last occupant to use when she became too infirm to use the home's grand staircase from the 2nd floor. On one occasion, I came into work and the elevator was wide open and didn't close or react in any way for 5 or so minutes, even when I walked in and out of it a couple of times. It did have a history of opening and closing its doors from time to time, but I'd seen other elevators do this on shows like Ghost Hunters where they debunked it. But that was usually 30 seconds or so, not 5 minutes. 2 co-workers also reportedly heard voices coming from the elevator shaft, which sounded like a conversation. The most memorable experience I had was when I was looking for the male co-worker I previously mentioned for a meeting. We were closed to the public, and all the other staff members were accounted for. The acoustics of the house were such that I could stand in the central rotunda of the house and be able to hear everyone on the 1st and 2nd floor of the public areas. I called his name, but didn't hear any response. I went up the grand staircase and checked those rooms on the 2nd floor before passing into the servants' area. While there, I heard footsteps above me on the 3rd floor landing. Now, there's only one stair to access the 3rd floor, so I figured he'd be able to hear me when I called his name. But no response. Well, I went up to the 3rd floor, which is essentially a circular hallway. While you can't see around it completely, you can hear everything. I called his name again and walked the entire circular hallway, but I didn't see anyone. No lights were on, the doors were locked, and even checking the door to the attic showed that there were no lights on there. Confused as to the source of the footsteps I'd heard, I went down 2 flights of stairs, ready to tell everyone that I couldn't find my co-worker, only to run into him coming out of the basement. There was no direct way to get to the basement from the 3rd floor. The elevator didn't go to that floor, and I knew he couldn't have used the stairs. I asked, and he'd never heard me calling his name, and he'd been in the basement for the last 15 minutes, which was longer than I'd been looking for him. There was no other explanation for the footsteps, which, on later reflection, didn't even match his 6'2" frame. They sounded lighter and more like that of a female. I knew my female co-workers were all on the 1st level, so it wasn't any of them. An interesting side note of history is that only female servants lived in the house. The men either lived off the property or across the way above the carriage house. The 3rd floor had some servants' rooms, plus the nursery and children's rooms, which would have been more of a female servant's domain than a male's. In the nearly 4 years I worked for the museum, I never felt uncomfortable in the house. I would frequently be the last one there at night, and could be anywhere from the basement to the attic. I never felt unsafe, except when I might be afraid of tripping over something in the dark. But as one former employee told me, the house would let you know when it was time to go home. But that was frequently because you'd put in over 10 hours that day and it was late. I still always greeted whoever might be listening in the morning and bid them good night as I was leaving, just in case.
And thank you to Elizabeth for sharing that story. The first thing that came to mind for me was, like the paranormal radar story we've just had, is that it called the police automatically.
Yeah, with the alarms being set off and they couldn't find any cause for it. Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, luckily not some kind of spooky answering the phone. It was just the alarm playing up. But yeah, definitely on a theme today.
Well, I've got to say, the thing that got me was the bit about Elizabeth's experiences in the bathroom, because it just hit so close to home. It's one of my biggest fears. I mean, you can probably understand it, as you know, if you listen to our Halloween episode. We used to live in a haunted house where going to the bathroom could be a very scary experience.
Oh, didn't it just?
And also, we visit a lot of old, creepy places, and one does have to go to the bathroom occasionally. And we do tend to go during quiet times when I am alone. And there is always that niggling fear at the back of my mind that I'm going to hear something happening that is occurring between me and the exit. This sounds like exactly what happened to poor Elizabeth.
I must admit, the first thought that came into my head when she said, "Oh, I was alone and the toilet flushed," was, what's scary about that? And then obviously remembered that I'm a gent, and in the gents you tend to have urinals that flush automatically every now and again.
Oh, do you?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I didn't know. Not so in the ladies, I'm afraid, but I didn't know that. You learn something new every day. Not sure I needed to learn that, but never mind. No, I can't think of any reason that the toilet would just flush on its own in the ladies.
No, but it certainly sounds like quite an active building, although I must admit I like the fact that it wasn't intimidating.
No, it sounds like an amazing building, and I'd love to go and visit. It sounds incredible.
From the sounds of things, it reminds me of my parents' house, where there is something there, and I've sort of hinted at it a few times. I've never really gone into detail on it on the show.
Yet.
I will at some point. But yeah, there's something there that is benevolent.
It feels sort of comforting and like another person, really.
Yeah, just whenever it's around, it feels like you've got a friend with you. It's quite sort of reassuring and pleasant. And that was the sort of general feel I got from this story.
Yeah, definitely. I love the fact that she says, good morning and good night to it as well. I think that's brilliant.
Oh, definitely. And thank you again to Elizabeth for sharing that story with us. We've got more true ghost stories coming up for you in just a moment.
But first, we've got some updates from our listeners as they took to our Facebook group to share their experiences in reaction to something we shared on last month's episode. Last episode, we heard from Melissa about a very strange thing that occurred while she and her family were watching the movie The Exorcist for the first time. Well, it appears that she's not the only one who had strange things happen during the movie. One of our longtime listeners, Jan, got in touch with her own frightening exorcist experience. She said, "I just listened to the most recent episode, and the story about watching The Exorcist reminded me of something similar that happened when I first watched it. The only time I watched it was when it first aired on UK TV, which was March the 17th, 2001. I was sitting alone in my bedroom, and when the crucifix scene came on, where Reagan's mum burst into her room and there's things flying across her room and smashing against the window, something unexplainable happened. On the wall of my room next to my mirror was a plastic hanging holder for my hairdryer. The hairdryer would fit nozzle downwards, and the handle lay in an indentation within the tray. To fit the nozzle through the hole, I had to remove the attachment that fitted on the end to direct the airflow, and I would place that on top of the holder between the wall and the handle of the hairdryer. The attachment always sat there without ever moving. It couldn't move without external force. And yet, during that scene, it flew about 3 feet across my room and hit the door. It was incredibly unnerving. Nothing like that had ever happened before, and it never happened again afterwards either. It was very strange.
It does sound very strange.
That's so bizarre. How could that even happen? I don't understand.
No, you can understand things falling off and it being a bit strange, but things to actually fly across the room.
That's not falling,
when
though.
Things were, flying across the room, and that if anything is in the house, it's just like, here is my moment.
This is my moment.
I'm so going to freak these people out. Bang.
Maybe that's it. But I mean, yeah, it really sounds like it stirred something up. Oh my God, I would have been terrified.
Is it possibly because they were scared and that sort of
fueled it somehow?
Yeah, I've got off my high horse and thrown my skeptic hat well into the bushes now. But yeah, is it possible that they're just a bit freaked out and the sort of energy of being freaked out is giving it enough to move something?
I mean, it could be. We've heard that a lot where, poltergeists almost try and make you more scared because your fear feeds them. I don't know, but I tell you one thing, I never would have watched The Exorcist again if that had happened to me.
I think I mentioned it last episode, but I don't think I've seen it all the way through.
No, and I don't think I have either. I think we're going to have to do that. Well, I don't do we want to do that? Is that a good idea?
I think we're going to have to at some point. We're not anything in the world of spooky until we've seen The Exorcist, are we?
Yeah, I guess so.
If we go to any conventions or anything, we're going to be booted out the door.
For not watching The Exorcist
Who do
all the way
think
through.
You are?
Okay, we'll do it. It will happen. We'll let you guys know when we sit down and watch it, and we'll let you know if anything happens.
And Jan wasn't the only one to share her experience. We heard from listener Julia, and she said, "The Exorcist is one of my favourite movies. I've scared the pants off of myself plenty of times whilst watching it. Sadly, no paranormal experiences. The story does remind me of something strange that's happened with my cat, though. Normally, Prudence, the cat, doesn't pay any attention to what I'm watching or listening to. I'm a big horror fan, so she's had plenty of exposure to the sights and sounds of the genre. One night, I was laying in bed listening to an episode of The Paranormal Scholar about Annalise Michael. If you're not familiar with the story, it's a controversial case of a possession from Germany. Prudence was asleep at the foot of my bed, facing away from me. I was listening on my iPad and had earbuds in. Prudence's sensitive kitty ears could probably hear it, but it wouldn't have been very loud. The episode had audio recordings of the actual exorcism, and when it got to the part where the demon voices shouts in guttural German, "I am Judas, I am Hitler," Prudence jumped up and came running towards the iPad. she sniffed it with ears laid back and tail twitching. She then growled, turned tail and ran from the room. I've always thought the Annalise Michael story was questionable, but Prudence's reaction to the demon voice has me thinking again. On another occasion, I was laying in bed watching a documentary about the Codex Gigas. Prudence was asleep on my chest, and when it got to the part about the illustration that's allegedly of the devil himself, she opened her eyes, turned her head to the screen, growled and ran from the room. I guess Prudence just doesn't like demons.
Very sensible, Prudence. But seriously, that is weird. Have you heard the recordings of that exorcism?
No, I haven't. I've heard the name, but I don't think I've seen it.
No, I mean, you must be familiar with the case, but I want to say give them a listen, but they are awful.
Is it one of those that you don't want to listen to just before bed?
No, you definitely don't want to listen to it just before bed. They are quite horrifying. And I'm the same. I've always been very skeptical of the case. It really feels like just an awful case of terrible negligence, for want of a better word. But the voices during the exorcism do make you second guess that. They are dreadful.
I will check it out during daylight hours with a kitty guardian.
Very sensible. But thank you for sharing those experiences with us. We love hearing from you guys on our Facebook group. Please do carry on. And if you haven't joined already, hop on over and join in the fun. And now on to our second story of the episode. And this one is from Shaun T.
I grew up in a small town in the northwest corner of Arkansas, whose only claim to fame is a Civil War battle and a battlefield park that is truly eerie and beautiful. My childhood home is the one my grandparents bought in the 80s that my dad and his siblings grew up in. My grandparents raised me there, and from a young age they told stories of the house being haunted. My granddad had several experiences with an apparition he described as a young First Nations boy who he would see playing or just sitting about. Not always a level-headed man, he did at one point break a plate because the boy would not answer his questions. My dad tells the story of being home alone as a young teenager, having played in a baseball game while the family was out on the lake for a weekend away. The house was absolutely empty except for my dad, and he heard heavy footfalls in the garage, as if someone in heavy boots was walking around. He assumed that my granddad had come back and was trying to scare him, so he went out there and the garage was empty. He called the campground my grandparents were at and demanded they come get him that instant. Growing up in the house, I don't know that I ever actually connected the goings-on to the stories I'd been told, but I would hear what I thought was my grandparents shouting my name to come to the front room, only to be told they'd not called me when I came. It happened often enough that I can't believe it was just them playing tricks. I was in one of the back bedrooms with the door shut one afternoon while they were out, and I opened the door to go out into the hall so that I could go to the bathroom. I saw a man's hand recede into the shadow of the hall and disappear, as if it had been reaching for the door, only to be surprised by me opening it. The most common occurrence was just an intense sense of wrongness or unease when I was by myself in the house, as if the house itself didn't want me there. My family always talks of the ghosts as funny, occasionally frightening presences, but none of them seem to share my ill-at-ease sentiments. I would refuse to look in mirrors with the lights off, particularly the one at the end of the hallway on the linen closet door. I'd swear to seeing shadows when I was going down the hall, but only in the mirror. Even now, my grandmother still lives there, and I cannot walk down that hall without feeling that uneasiness, that feeling of being unwelcome.
Thank you, Shaun, for sharing those experiences with us. I think the most creepy thing about that for me was when he saw the hand disappearing.
Yeah, that certainly brought Abington back to mind, our spooky house where we first lived together.
And frequently saw shadows sort of disappearing around corners very much in that manner. I thought it was really interesting that he found it a lot more sinister than his other family members.
Yeah, I was intrigued by that as well. I tend to find that in a lot of places, everybody seems to get a similar feeling.
Mm-hmm.
Although I must admit, saying that, I was saying earlier about the house where it's sort of a pleasant presence and everything's hunky-dory,
Yeah.
feels comforting. We had somebody that was working on our patio when we first moved in. Big, burly Australian builder guy. He kept thinking my dad was coming up to speak to him, and there was nobody there, and he just downed tools and left.
Oh, really?
Mhm.
So he never came back?
No. And one of my parents' friends, who interestingly is really into the paranormal, loves UFOs and that sort of stuff, he kept seeing what we were seeing, and it properly freaked him out, and he really didn't like it.
So he had a totally different reaction. That is really interesting because everybody else I know has found that house really just pleasant and comfortable, and yeah, there's something going on, but not felt it in a sinister way at all. So yeah, that does sound really similar. I mean, the only thing I can think is that is Shaun sort of more in tune with it, like on a different level than the rest of his family? So it just makes him feel that uncomfortable, uneasy sense somehow?
I don't know. I mean, my thought was perhaps, he was witnessing something and he was simply reacting to something that wasn't quite right.
Yeah, it sounded a bit more all-pervading than that. The other thing I have to mention is not being able to look into mirrors in the dark. I completely get you. I'm totally with you, Shaun. My mum, in completely uncharacteristic fashion for her, once when I was a kid, on a Halloween night, told me that if on Halloween night at midnight you look into a mirror, you see the devil's face instead of your own. And I was only little. This is so unlike my mum.
It really is.
It's so unlike her.
This is from somebody that wouldn't let Lil have the salt in crisps. You know those old packets of crisps where the salt came in a separate packet? She was so sheltered that it's like you can have the crisps, but you're not allowed to have the salt on them.
To be fair, it was the 80s. There was a big salt scare. It was a whole thing. But yeah, my mum, not the sort of person to be telling horror stories to her kid on a Halloween night, but she did for whatever reason. She did. And since that time, I still am unable to look into a mirror in the dark. Even to this day.
I'm the other way. I don't like looking in mirrors in the daytime, but that's got more to do with what I look like than what I expect to see in them.
Bless you. But no, Shaun, I'm with you. I cannot look into mirrors in the dark either.
Thank you, Shaun, for sharing your story. And we've got our final listener story now. This one is from Shelyce in Florida.
I'm what some like to call a sensitive to the unknown. I can sense things, sometimes see things, and even dream things. It's a family trait with women on my mother's side, although no one talks of it, except my mother, and she says that her accepting and letting me talk about my experiences is why I still have it, and probably why it's the strongest with me. You know the expression, if you have a gift, use it, or one day you'll lose it. My mother says that's what happened to her and her sisters, along with others in our family. But my mother had always been supportive and understanding, and there for me when this gift, as she calls it, would terrify me. I've always been one to dream of sorrows to come, as I call it, for I have the sight of seeing when those to whom I am close will pass. It is a hard trait to have, and yes, a hard trait to believe in. My mother says it started when I was young. For how she tells it, I was only a toddler when I dreamt of my great-grandmother passing. But I was so young, I couldn't tell you if that was the case or just coincidence. But I can tell you of the times I've dreamt of grandparents passing, and even felt them passing. Especially both my grandmothers, who passed in my adult years, and I will never forget it. I remember a month before my father's mother passed that I had a dream of her funeral. A chilling thought, but she had been in hospital, so I said it was just my fears. But soon, my grandmother was back in the hospital, and the doctors said that they would be keeping her in for observations. That's never good, but they weren't calling the family in there, so there was hope. Or so we thought. I was at home working on a paper when all of a sudden I started weeping, crying uncontrollably. There was nothing on the TV to cause it. I only listen to music when I'm working on papers, and upbeat music at that, and nobody was home. As I cried, I called out for my granny. Minutes passed, and slowly I gathered myself. And then the phone rang. It was my mother telling me my granny had passed moments ago, and that she had had to compose herself before calling me. I simply replied, I know. Years later, my mother's mum, Mormor, was sick, but nothing to be too alarmed about. She was getting older, and a simple cold could keep her down longer than most. No need to worry. But slowly her cold worsened and turned into an infection. My mother and grandfather took care of my Mormor, making sure that she was getting the best help there was. Everything was fine. My mother said she'd talked to my Mormor and she was in high spirits, which made me feel a bit better, telling myself she would get through this. But then one morning, driving to work, that same weeping and uncontrollable crying came over me. I told myself my Mormor was fine. My mother had just talked to her. I pulled over into a gas station, and my mother once again called me, telling me the bad news. And this time I was already bawling my eyes out. This wasn't supposed to happen. They said she was getting better. As I spoke to my mother, she asked, "You knew before I called you, didn't you?" And again I responded, "I knew." Those were the two times I recall sensing something the strongest. But it doesn't only happen with losing those I love. I also sense spirits, and sometimes see them. I was about 6 or 7 when I saw my first spirit. And the fun part is that I never know they are spirits until afterwards. But they always appear to me just as if you came to me off the street. There's an old family house that resides in Reedsville, GA, that has been in our family for many generations on my father's side. This house was once a schoolhouse and is such a big part of the city's history that it's actually protected as a historic site. When I was young and my grandmother and her siblings were still alive, we would have family gatherings with all the kids and the grandchildren. It was always fun, but the house itself was not so much fun for me. I was always uneasy in this house, feeling as if I was being watched by someone. Even when just on the property, I could feel myself being watched, and to this day I still feel it. But this one particular time was more intense than the others. I was running through the small house with my cousins, just as kids do, when a tall, older gentleman in a suit stopped me. I was the baby, so I was always left behind. "Stop that running or you will fall," the man said to me. But he said it with such authority, I was frightened. I ran to the kitchen to my grandmother, tears in my eyes, thinking I was in trouble, but also afraid of the man I had never seen before. I explained to her and my great aunts what had happened. They called my father over and told him, and he went in search of the man. My father asked me what he looked like, but when I described him, My grandmother looked to her sister and the room fell silent. I was confused. Did they know him? My grandmother got up, went to the fire mantle in the living room and grabbed a picture. It was an old photo, even older than black and white. It was that rustic colour. She asked me if this was the man I saw. I looked at the photo and nodded. My grandmother told me not to worry, that it was just her father and he wouldn't hurt me. I shrugged it off and was waiting for him to come back. It wasn't until later that day, when everyone had left, that they explained her father had passed away quite some time ago. Needless to say, I never ran in the house again and was always looking over my shoulder for a glimpse of my great-grandfather. That was the first encounter I remember with a spirit, but definitely not my last.
And thank you to Shelyce for sharing those stories with us. I must say that, well, there's a lot to unpack in all of those, but the one thing that really jumped out at me was the point where she said that she tended to see things, but they just appeared as people. And I think that's a lot more common than people realise.
I completely agree with you. And I can think of a couple of my own personal experiences off the top of my head where, if it weren't for the environment I was in and the fact that I knew there shouldn't be anybody else in the house, I would never have known that what I'd seen was a ghost.
Yeah, and the time I saw my parents' friend that was working on our porch,
I think we talked about in the first episode.
I talked about in the first episode. I wouldn't have known if I hadn't have found that out. I wouldn't have known. I'd have just presumed he'd pop round.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think people probably see a lot more ghosts than they realise, but just because they're in a certain context, you just don't realise.
Yeah, it just doesn't seem unusual. But how cool is it to see your great-great-grandfather?
I think it was great-grandfather, but yes, even so, very cool. And I like that she said she was always hoping for another glimpse of him in a way.
Yeah, if I could see my ancestors, I'd love that.
Although it did sound like he was a bit stern, which
I think everybody was at that point, weren't they?
Yeah, quite possibly. And I agree with what she said about if you don't use your gift, you lose it. And I think that's why we hear of a lot of children having experiences when they're younger and then sort of losing that as they grow up and not seeing things as much, almost like they've grown out of it because they're kind of taught that it's not possible.
I found this interesting as well, but I honestly don't know what to make of it. I know, the human mind is a strange thing and you can see things that aren't there and you can not see things that are there and, through trickery and various other things. So it's not obviously out of the realms of possibility. I don't know personally what to make of it. It's weird. It does seem that kids tend to see a lot more than adults do, though.
Well, not so much the seeing ghost side of it, but the part of her gift that involves sensing the death of her loved ones must be really difficult to live with.
It doesn't sound like a fun gift, and it's one of those things that's like, if I have this, couldn't you at least have given me something that would help, that I could do something about?
I think we talked about this on the episode we did on premonitions. It's so hard because you've got to live with that knowledge, and really, can you do anything to change it? It's a big question for another time.
Yeah, definitely. And it literally sounds as if it's a case of like, this is happening right now and there's nothing you can do about it. It just saves a phone call.
It's just a bit of a forewarning or foreshadowing. I don't know. But thank you so much, Shelyce, for sharing that with us. And she does say that was not her last encounter with the spirit. So we would love to hear about your others if you wouldn't mind sharing them with us.
Oh, definitely. So thank you again to Shelyce, and thank you to all our listeners that are kind enough to share their personal experiences with us to share on the show. Your stories are the heart and soul of Not Once for Yes, and we hope we've created a safe space for like-minded people to share their experiences and openly discuss the paranormal. So if you have an experience you'd like to share, please do visit our website at notonceforyes.com, and you can send us your stories there, or just pop us an email at contact@notonceforyes.com. Now, sit back and relax while we tell you about what we did on our holiday In this episode's paranormal postcard.
With such an unexpectedly summery summer this year here in Blighty, I'd become rather determined that we should get ourselves to the seaside for a bit of a mini holiday. So, having lured Fitz with the promise of fresh whelks for tea, we loaded up the coffeemobile with tents and sleeping bags and headed to the coast. But of course, we weren't about to go on an adventure without fitting in a bit of spooky history. So as soon as the tent was pitched, we were back in the car and heading down the winding Norfolk country roads to Castle Rising. It may seem like the name is kind of the wrong way round. Surely it should be Rising Castle, right? But actually, Castle Rising is the name of the village in which the fortification stands. Archaeologists have found evidence of Roman and even prehistoric activity here. But the first true settlement is believed to have been Saxon, and the ruins of a Norman church, which can still be seen in the castle grounds, is thought to have been built on an earlier Saxon one of wooden construction. But it was the Norman lord, William d'Albini, who built a castle here, sometime around the year 1140. Some believe the name Rising comes from Risinger, of Saxon origin and meaning people of the gorse, reflecting the heathland of the area. Others think it comes from the Old English word rissa, meaning brushwood. Regardless of where the name came from, the word rising seems uncannily appropriate, considering how the castle has changed the topography of the countryside. The fortification does literally seem to be rising up from the very landscape itself. Quite aside from the forbidding-looking stone keep, the castle is surrounded by massive earthworks, some of the largest in the country, and the like of which I've never seen before. We all know that castles had moats or ditches for defence, and I've seen quite a few. But I've simply never found them so formidable before. Maybe a lot have slowly been worn away by time. Maybe it's just my lack of imagination. But it wasn't until I climbed to the top of the ringwork that encloses Castle Rising that I realised what a task it would be to storm these defences. To be fair, the great bank around the castle was originally half as high as it stands now. Probably in response to the threat of attack, sometime in the 1170s, William d'Albini decided to upgrade the castle's defences, including the tremendous task of doubling the height of the ringwork bank. As a result, the keep itself sits in a deep bowl, just peeking over the top of the earthworks, looking for all the world like the earth itself is rising up to swallow it. You can climb up to the top of the bank and traverse the whole length of it. I could see Fitz had wasted no time in scrambling to the top, as I spotted him, looking like a tiny speck so high up. Not to be outdone, I clambered up too, but it wasn't quite the romantic stroll I'd envisaged. I hadn't felt a breath of wind all day, but I suddenly found myself hanging grimly onto my hat to stop it being whisked away into the village below. The drop-off from the top of the bank to the bottom of the moat below was shockingly steep, and to be honest, not being the greatest fan of heights, once I'd got a glimpse of it, I found I rather wanted to flatten myself to the ground and hang on for dear life. I thought about how I couldn't imagine scrambling up that sheer face, even unencumbered, and then I thought about trying the same thing, weighted down in chainmail, armour plates, wielding heavy weapons and with deadly arrows being rained down about you. Impossible. In fact, there is no record that Castle Rising ever actually came under siege, but I was quite stunned at how vividly this put the whole purpose of earthworks into context for me, where so many castles before had not. It was just the first of many surprises.
Aside from a little weathering and staining, the keep must look much as it did in Norman times. Those imagining a grand castle like Warwick may be a little disappointed by its size, which is like to a small but tall manor house, but it was built to be the height of fashion, inspired by the design of the much admired keep at Norwich Castle. William Dalvini was very much trying to keep up with the royal building schemes of the time. Most impressive, I think, is the staircase from the main entrance to the waiting room. Grand rather than martial, they draw you up to the imposing wooden doors of the waiting room that incidentally have been noted by previous custodian of Castle Rising and paranormal investigator Norman Fahey to open themselves during the night. He reports that he would often open up in the morning only to find that these inner doors were open, even though he had securely locked and bolted them the night before. Spookily, during a TV paranormal investigation of Castle Rising, these doors were recorded on camera, opening in the early hours of the morning, not long before Norman would normally have opened up the site. It's only when entering the keep that its status as a ruin becomes apparent. That's not to say that it's tumble down or poorly maintained, simply that all the wooden structures are no longer present. The floors of each level have long since gone, leaving only holes in the stone walls to mark the location of the floors in the Great Hall and accompanying chambers. Much of the roof is also no more, meaning that you can stand in the basement and look up to see open sky. On one hand, it's a shame to not be able to tour the building in its full glory, but on a positive note, for historical and construction geeks like myself, it allows an interesting peek into the construction methods of the time.
Some castles are just bare bones of their former selves. Some are quite intact and decked out to reflect their heyday. I love them all equally, but Castle Rising was an odd example of both of these states at the same time. In some sections where the floors had fallen through, the skeleton of the keep was laid bare to the elements through the gaping window arches. But up an echoing spiral staircase and through a dark passageway, you would turn a corner and come across rooms that were completely intact. Walls whitewashed, fireplaces with their original tiles, windows sealed with ancient glass, whose warped panes drew the eye, inviting you to hope that you might just catch a glimpsed reflection of the room as it once was, bustling with medieval activity. We were able to get a sense of how thick the stone walls really are. In the 16th century, the Great Hall floor collapsed, so, needing to find a way to traverse this section of the keep, they made a way around the edge of the building by forcing a passage through the thickness of the wall. And we're not talking about a tight, cramped space. This is a corridor that's perfectly comfortable to walk through. No need to shimmy along. It's more than person width. It's something else I've often read in the history books. I know that castle walls were built several feet thick, but it's not easy to put something like this into context. Until, that is, you find yourself actually walking through the middle of one. One of the most intact rooms, still boasting glazed windows and whitewashed walls, is known by many as the White Room, and it's said that this room is central to the activity of the castle's most famous ghostly resident, Queen Isabella, the she-wolf of France. Isabella came from French royalty, but left her home country at the tender age of 12 to be married off to King Edward II of England in the year 1308. Like many such marriages, it was an unhappy one, and although they had children together, Edward was much more interested in a series of male companions than he was in Isabella, and he snubbed her quite cruelly and publicly, sitting with his favourite of the time at their wedding celebrations instead of his new wife, and giving away Isabella's own jewellery to his preferred romantic partners. It seems Edward wasn't only thoughtless in his marriage, but also with affairs of the crown. He broke his promises of reforms, became deeply in debt, and lost disastrous campaigns against the Scots. Unsurprisingly, he became very unpopular, and Queen Isabella grew weary of trying to mediate between her reckless husband and his increasingly restless barons. Whilst on a diplomatic mission to Paris in 1325, Isabella began an affair with an exiled Englishman, Roger Mortimer, and despite his previous disinterest, when Edward found out, he threatened to kill his wife. When Isabella did eventually leave Paris and return to England, it was to invade, with her lover Roger Mortimer at her side as her captain. King Edward was captured, imprisoned, and eventually murdered, leaving Isabella to take control of the country on behalf of her son, the new King Edward III, until he came of age. When he did come of age, however, the new king overthrew his mother and had both her and Roger Mortimer arrested. Her lover was tried for treason and beheaded, and his mother was imprisoned at Castle Rising. Local legend tells of Isabella's part in instigating a particularly gruesome murder of her husband, and how either the guilt or the loneliness of her isolation in the bleak Norfolk landscape turned her mad. For centuries since her death, it's been said that her maniacal laughter can be heard reverberating within the castle walls, and that locals in the village below can hear her tormented screams piercing the night air. Some stories have her spectre roaming the battlements on stormy nights. An even more dramatic legend tells of the White Wolf of Castle Rising, an apparition of a giant snow-white wolf with blazing red eyes and fangs dripping blood, howling from the battlements on the night of a full moon. In some versions of the tale, a spectral knight in armour appears to challenge the beast, although the origin of this story is unclear, as is how closely connected it is to Isabella and her moniker of the She-Wolf of France. It seems clear that Isabella was vilified after she was removed from power, and that the grisly legends that grew up around Castle Rising have served to perpetuate this demonisation. In truth, she seems to have been well liked by her contemporaries, with many preferring her to her reckless husband. She was noted as being intelligent, charming, and skilled at diplomacy. Indeed, her actions led to the signing of a peace treaty between England and Scotland, bringing an end to the First Scottish War of Independence. She wasn't quite the desolate and pathetic prisoner legend makes her out to be either. Although she was originally placed under house arrest by her son, when she moved to Castle Rising, which was in fact her property, it was to retire in relative ease, with a new suite of rooms being built for her comfort and a hefty pension of £3,000 a year. She entertained guests, visited her grandchildren, and enjoyed hunting with the Irish wolfhound she kept at the castle. She didn't die at Castle Rising at all, and far from howling from the lonely battlements, she became a nun before her death at the then ripe old age of 66. And to further deconstruct the stereotype of a vicious and power-hungry queen, there's no evidence that the horrific way she ordered her husband to be murdered is anything more than legend. Although, to be fair, she probably did still have him murdered, so she was no saint. But it seems to me like she was a strong woman who was deeply insulted by her husband and was rather better at ruling the country than he was. And some people didn't want her remembered that way, so they turned her into a snarling, bloodthirsty ghoul of legend. Still, it can't be denied that there are continuing reports of paranormal activity at Castle Rising right up until this day, with many still attributing at least some of the hauntings to Isabella. Some visitors find the castle extremely sinister. People have reported the feeling of being watched and the sense that they are unwelcome. Some have found the atmosphere so disturbing that they've had to leave, whilst others have been physically pushed. It seems the wailing noises are more than just the stuff of legend, as they continue to be heard to this day, along with the sounds of a child weeping. Another report, though, is of a far less sinister nature. In his book, Norfolk, A Ghost Hunter's Guide, Neil Story recounts the tale of a visitor who encountered a much more peaceful apparition. The story tells of a visitor who stopped on the stairs when she came across a woman and toddler in medieval dress. The woman was carefully helping the child negotiate the difficult steps, and the visitor, assuming they were reenactors, thought nothing of it. After they'd passed, the visitor turned to ask what special event they were there for, but discovered the woman and child had simply vanished. Staff later confirmed that there were no special events that day and no reenactors in medieval dress.
Several investigations have been carried out at the site, and there have been a fair few interesting encounters there. Some notable occasions include the investigation carried out by the Essex ghost hunting team, in which group leader Andy Radley captured a picture of what he believes is Queen Isabella. The team shared the image with the UK newspapers and will link to the article in the show notes on the website. The image was taken in the White Room, which apparently is a hotspot for activity and one of the few rooms still to be glazed and not open to the elements. It was taken using a full spectrum camera, which, if you're not familiar with the term, is basically a camera that can capture wavelengths outside of the range of normal human vision. Two members of the team are clearly visible, one sitting to the left of the frame and one standing behind a tripod operating another camera to the right. Between the two is something unusual. With a texture like that of smoke or mist, but without the wispiness that would be associated with it, can be seen what appears to be a lady in a dress. The image in negative gives a clearer outline, though it's still obviously transparent. The team also claim that they can make out a wolf at her feet, though to me it appears more like the train of a long dress. Do check out the pictures and let us know what you think. Perhaps the most famous investigation was the visit of the Ghost Hunters International team. They visited Castle Rising in April of 2011, and along with the site's custodian and also a paranormal enthusiast, Norman Fahey, they recorded their investigation to be later shown as an episode on the Sci-Fi Channel entitled Search for the She-Wolf. Of particular interest was the question of whether the activity was centred on the location or on Norman himself. It certainly seemed that the activity was most apparent in his presence, and frustratingly, much of it was in the dungeon where the public do not have access, so we were unable to investigate for ourselves. Between Norman and the GHI team, they experienced sudden drops in temperature, a growl, footsteps, a whisper, a strange dizzy spell, an EVP saying "go home," strange lights, and Norman even believed he saw Barry's face morph, though Chris, who was with them, didn't see it. As skeptical as I am of TV paranormal shows as a rule, the evidence that they present wasn't terribly outlandish, and Norman did state he had previously heard a voice where the EVP was captured, likewise telling him to go home. For my own part, I found some of the light anomalies in the dungeon the most interesting. The dungeon is underground and has no windows, so it's quite obvious that these lights were not external contamination. There were some small lights both seen by the investigators and captured on camera. Not having seen the room or been present for the investigation, there isn't much to be said about what these might have been, and if they could have been paranormal. What I found most interesting, however, was after they'd all left the room, the cameras picked up a much stranger light. It seems to appear in the middle of the room above head height. It doesn't appear that anyone or thing has entered the room, and the light doesn't appear to illuminate anything else in the room. I'm honestly not sure what to make of it, but I would love to investigate further. Unfortunately, as to whether it was due to the number of people there that day, there was nothing there to sense, or that we'd simply visited at the wrong time. The staircase was the only place that I had even a hint of a vibe at Castle Rising. Touring the rest of the keep, from the gloomy well in the basement to the surprisingly homely white room on the top floor, the keep felt as dead as the stone from which it was composed. Looking back on it now, this may have been a sign in itself. I'm struggling to think of anywhere that I visited, especially one with so much history, that did not have some kind of feel to it. Be it the safe comfort of home, the bustle of a supermarket, the hum of a busy office, or the thick sense of history at an ancient monument, the utter absence of any feel to the place, in retrospect, was quite odd.
I'm afraid to report that I was the same. I was quite disappointed to feel absolutely nothing. But you're right, looking back on it now, it was feeling nothing in an odd way. It was completely blank.
Yeah, I didn't notice it at the time. I just thought, oh, it's a bit of a shame I'm not really getting a vibe from it. But yeah, thinking on it now, it was an absence of a vibe. It wasn't just that it didn't really have much of one. It was just
A void.
yeah, it was very strange.
And now I'm wondering, it's really interesting what the GHI team considered to be the fact that the haunting was all centred around Norman. And we've seen this before at the Ram Inn with John Humphreys. I don't know whether you're familiar with the case, but all the activity seemed to be centred around the owner of this building. And it sounds like it was the same at Castle Rising. I know he wasn't the owner, but he was obviously, being the custodian, he probably spent the most time there and had the deepest connection with it. So my question is he still the custodian?
No, he's not. He's not been for quite a while.
Which leads me to wonder, is that why there's such an absence of feeling? I'd be really, really interested to know of anybody that's visited while he was there or has since done an investigation after he's left as to whether there's any difference.
That's an interesting thought, actually. Like you were saying about the Ram Inn, I've heard of teams that have been since he passed, and they say it's much quieter now.
Really?
Yeah.
And to me, that makes quite a lot of sense.
Norman has his own website, And if you want to learn more about the history and the paranormal side of Castle Rising, I do suggest you check it out. There's a lot on there, including accounts from people who've been part of paranormal investigations, and visitors' photographs which have come out showing some very strange anomalies. It's certainly worth a look, and I'll put a link in the show notes on our website.
We'll also link to the news story that shows the photograph that the Essex ghost hunting team took. I'd be really interested to hear you guys' opinion on what you can see in the picture, because Fitz and I see slightly different things. Now, I see the dog really, really clearly, much more than I can see a woman in a dress.
Well, you see, looking at it, I can kind of see what you're seeing, but when it's like one of those pictures that can be two things, sort of like the
magic
vase
eye.
and the faces. I was looking at it and I saw what you saw, and then I saw another dog face in a different position, and I was like,
is it just pareidolia?
Yeah, I think, it's quite possible that is the case in this and many other cases, but, it does appear to be a woman in a dress, and if you look at it as I did initially, it does look like the train of a dress. But yeah, I can kind of see where they're coming from with the dog thing.
And I can see the dog really clearly, especially I think because that I've talked a lot about Isabella's Irish wolfhounds that she liked to keep at the castle.
Very small for a wolfhound, though.
I see. I didn't. In comparison to
the size of wolfhounds? They're
they're massive.
Horses.
That's what I'm seeing in the picture. I'm seeing a massive dog and a figure that looks in proportion to that for the size of an Irish wolfhound. We seem to be seeing more different things than I realised.
We are seeing completely different things.
Well, we'll post it on Facebook and see what you guys think. It will be very interesting. But unfortunately, the only thing that freaked me out at Castle Rising was that there was a flagpole, and occasionally the wind would catch the flag on the flagpole and make this tapping noise that would echo through the dark and spooky corridors. But I'm afraid it was nothing paranormal at all. So that was what we did on our holidays.
And if you've been somewhere spooky on your holidays, please do send us your own paranormal postcard. We would love to read it, and even better, share it with our listeners on the show. I'm afraid that's pretty much all we've got time for this episode. If you've enjoyed the show, please do subscribe, rate, review, share with your friends. If you've got a paranormal story that you'd like to share, get in touch through the website at knockoncevs.com. If you'd like to help support the show, you can do so through Ko-fi or Patreon, links to which can be found on the website too. And we hope you'll join us next time.
EVP session end.